Be God. Thank you, Arnie. God, we ask you to open our ears that we might hear your voice speaking to us in these moments together. Amen. Psychologist by the name of John Trent talked about one of the greatest disappointments of his life. You see, his father had abandoned the family when he was actually just a baby. And so his mother raised him and his brother by herself. Well, one day in his junior year of high school, out of the blue, his dad called. John and his brother played high school football, and he had seen in the local paper that they were on the football team, and he said that he wanted to meet them after the game on that Friday. And so John was so excited. All his life he had dreamed of meeting his father and finding out who this man was and what he was like. And now that dream was actually going to come true. Friday evening, both boys played as hard as they could in that game, hoping that their dad would see them and that he would be proud of them. After the game, they waited in the stands. As every man walked by, they thought, is this him? But it wasn't. Again and again, people passing by. But their father never showed up. They had waited with so much hope, and their father had broken a promise that he made to them, and he'd not even shown up to meet them. The people of Israel were waiting for a Messiah. They had been waiting for hundreds of years for this Messiah to come. When John the Baptist began preaching and teaching, the people were so excited that they started asking John if he was the Messiah. And of course, as we know, we read last week, John told them, no, but there's one coming, one greater than me. In 10 days, we're going to celebrate the coming of that child, that baby. As we prepare for that day, there are some truths about the coming of Jesus that I'd like to discuss for a few minutes. First of all, Jesus, that baby, was the fulfillment of God's promise. John Trent and his brother waited to meet their dad. He didn't show up. In fact, they never met him. That would never happen to God's people, because our God is a promise keeper. He makes promises, and he's good for his word. The words of John the Baptist, as we read them last week, seem pretty harsh. John said to the crowds coming out to be baptized by him, "You brood of vipers," he called them snakes, "who warned you to flee from the coming wrath?" Brood of vipers? Flee from coming wrath? What does that have to do with Christmas, with the coming of the baby Jesus? We need to understand the context, the situation back in that day. You see, Israel was oppressed most of the time by one enemy or another, usually the Romans. Some were cruel and merciless. And God had promised them that there would come a day when good would win over all evil. In dark days like that, they hung on to that promise, remembering what they'd been taught. The crueler their enemies were, the greater their faith that God would one day deliver them from these enemies. If John's preaching seems pretty harsh, and it does, it's because he was talking to people who were struggling to hold on to the promises of God while they were under a great deal of stress and fear that we probably can't even imagine. It's like something that happened in World War II. Jewish people, as you know, were rounded up into concentration camps. They were beaten, they were starved, they were tortured, they were humiliated, and many of them were gassed to death. In fact, over 6 million Jews. were killed by the Nazis. The Jews knew that if they fought back in any way when they were in these concentration camps, that they'd be brutally punished. But one little group of Jewish prisoners found a way to resist their enemies without getting caught. A guy by the name of Raphael Schechter was a young Jewish conductor who was imprisoned in the Terezin concentration camp. And his anger burned toward the Nazis. One day, he had an idea, a way that he might be able to channel this anger. And so he gathered a small group of prisoners together, and he began teaching them the music to a song. The song was called Verdi's Requiem. The Requiem, which was written in Latin, is about freedom, and it's about God's punishment of wrongdoing. A translation of one chorus goes like this: "The day of wrath, that day shall dissolve the world in ash. What trembling there shall be when the judge shall come. Nothing shall remain unavenged." Harsh words. But as Schechter put it, he said, we can sing to the Nazis what we can't say to them. And so he gathered 150 people into a choir in the camps. The Nazis ignored them. They didn't care if the choir sang, because you see, this camp was a propaganda camp. It was set up to make it look like to the outside world how kind the Nazis were to the Jews. And since none of the Nazi guards spoke Latin, they didn't know the meaning of any of the words to that song. And eventually they got to the point where they sang it so good that the high-ranking officials in the camp and even other high-ranking German officials came to listen to them sing. The members of the choir knew that if the Nazis found out what they were doing and what those words meant, that they would be killed. But they did it anyway. And through the music, that was their way of confronting their enemies and remembering that one day God would judge everyone involved. If John the Baptist sounded a little bit harsh, it's because he lived in a harsh, cruel world. And he pronounced God's judgment on the world. That's what a prophet does. It's a prophet's job to pronounce God's righteousness to the people and to judge society based on what that prophet sees. And John was a prophet. I wonder what John would say today if he were to come visit us in the United States of America. Oh boy, what would that preaching be like? I'll let you fill in the blanks. But remember, and don't ever forget this, our God is a promise keeper. Evil will be defeated in the end, and good will reign triumphant in the end. First of all, Jesus was the fulfillment of God's promise. Second, as many of us know, God doesn't always work in the ways that we expect God to. If you were to ask the people of Israel how they expected their Messiah to come, I don't think any of them would have said, well, Isaiah says that a child will be born for us, a son given to us, authority rests upon his shoulders, he is named Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. They didn't expect a baby to come, to be born in a humble stable to a couple people that nobody knew. They thought he was going to come probably on a white horse with an army of 10,000 behind him to rescue them and to save them. But it was a very humble beginning, as we know, for the King of Kings. No wonder it was so hard for people to accept that that little baby was God in the flesh. But when you study history, you learn that most of the time, people only see the good or only see God's work after the fact, after it happens. just like our own country. Kids, did you know that there was a time when African American men and women were by law, because of the color of their skin, they were considered second-class citizens. They were not important. They didn't matter. In some parts of our country, they were only allowed to go in certain restaurants or hotels. If you were black, you had to use a different bathroom. If you were black, you could not drink from a water fountain that white people drank from. You had to ride in the back seats of the bus. Now, I know some of you like to ride in the back seat, but they would have liked to have ridden in the front once in a while, I bet. They had to go to separate schools. This was the law. And here's the sad part. Many, many white people, even church people, supported it and thought it was right and it was the way it should be. I've learned in recent years that in this Illinois Valley, if your skin was black and you were in LaSalle or Peru, you had to be out of town before it got dark outside. And so there'd be hotels on the edge of town where these people would have to go just because they had a different color of skin. So don't point your finger at all those people that did that and say they were bad, because we were bad too. 100 years before that, landowners, mostly in the South, you've probably learned about slaves in school, right, kids? How people were treated as property and they were owned by the plantation owner. Imagine that you could own another person in the United States of America. What would we say? What would make anyone think that that was okay? As we look back on it, we say that's horrible. And we're ashamed for those people. Yet today, there are still injustices going on in our country, and we choose to turn away and not notice. Too often, we see these things only in the rearview mirror, only when we look back. Here's another example. As far back as I can remember, people who are experts in their field have been warning us, as long as I can remember, about taking care of the earth and about being careful about pollution and being careful and the fact that global warming could take place. When moves were first made to clean up our air and our water, good people, Christian people, were calling the people who cared about our environment back then all kinds of nasty names. You even hear those names sometimes these days. This is not to say that the environmental movement is always right about everything, because they're not. But they sure were right about some things. It's coming to fruition. I wonder, 50 years from now, which of the things that our society disagrees with today will be seen as right and maybe as coming from God. There will be some, I'm sure of it. God comes in ways we do not expect, but God does always show up. God always comes. I don't know why God's Son was born in a stable. I don't understand that. No matter how much we romanticize it today, it seems to be a strange place, doesn't it? For the birth of the Son of God. Sure not the place I would have chosen. I don't think any of you would have either. God doesn't always come in the way we might expect God to. But Christmas is our reminder that God does come. God comes with righteousness and justice and love and comfort to those who are hurting. Here's one final thought for this third Sunday in Advent. I can't believe it's already the third Sunday. The coming of Jesus means the opportunity for a new beginning. John the Baptist came preaching judgment. That was the message that he knew best and that he was sent out to preach. Jesus came bringing grace and love and hope and peace and joy, those things we talk about at Advent. John's preaching was based on the law. And by those standards, back in that day, everybody was a failure. Jesus' teaching were based on God's love and on love's standards. Teaching that we are all, I got that in bold letters in my notes, that we are all accepted by God. The coming of the Christ child marked a new beginning for humankind. That's why we call the book that describes this new approach to life the New Testament. Because it was a new beginning for people, a new beginning for any person who chooses to open his or her heart to the love of that Christ child that was born on Christmas. There's a Christmas hymn that reminds me that there is in this world something that is truly wonderful and beautiful. It's not so much the hymn itself that reminds me, but the way it came to be written. Philip Brooks was an unsuccessful teacher. His students didn't respect him. And Brooks wrote to a friend one day that he was tired, angry, and felt like he was almost dead at the end of a really hard day at school. I'm sure some of you teachers and retired teachers can probably relate to that. You have those days. And soon after, Brooks was fired from his job. And he wrote, "I don't know what will become of me, and I really don't much care." But that isn't the end of his story. He became a Christian, and his faith gave him a new sense of confidence, a new sense of joy. He went on to become one of the finest preachers in the 19th century. Everywhere he went, crowds would gather to listen to him preach. And one day he sat down and he wrote a little Christmas hymn. "O little town of Bethlehem, how still we see thee lie. Above thy deep and endless sleep the silent stars go by. Yet in thy dark streets shineth the everlasting light. The hopes and fears of all the years are met in thee tonight." Philip Brooks knew about hopes and fears. He knew about new beginnings. New beginnings are available to anyone who will allow God's love to fill their hearts. So we say with Ebenezer Scrooge this morning, "Come up here, boy or girl. Come up here, dad or mom. I've got something wonderful for you." Jesus is the fulfillment of everything God has promised. Amen.